Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Alex Trenoweth, and I'm absolutely delighted to be a speaker for Stormie Grace's YouTube Academy. I'm going to be talking a bit about Jupiter and Saturn cycles for parents and teachers, and how we can use astrology in our classrooms to improve education for our children, to help parents understand their children better, and basically to create better relationships between parents and teachers and the students. So, we live in challenging times, and it's kind of in that spirit of making things easier and more comprehensive that I'm giving this lecture. And I will not have time to go through individual Jupiter and Saturn signs, but I will show you where you can go to find a free chart calculator. It's from my website. It's absolutely free. I also do reports for Adolescence if you're interested in having a computer-generated astrology chart, which is significantly cheaper than hiring a professional astrologer. This is a recording, so Stormie and I will be in the chat talking to you and answering your questions, and I'm hoping that you really enjoy this and get a lot out of it. I'd love to hear from you if you have, and so here we go. So I have spent about 20 years in the classroom. I started off teaching English, and I have done a variety of different subjects. I taught high school, and here in England, high school, well, we call it secondary school, it starts at the age of 11. So you have to be 11 years old on the 1st of September in order to become part of secondary school. So that's a lot different than America. As I said, I taught a variety of subjects. I taught history. Here I am teaching chemistry, and I've taught music as well, on top of English and religious education. A few years ago, I made the transition to not be full-time, employed full-time, and I started doing what we call supply work. Americans call it substitute work, where I went around in a variety of different classrooms, different schools, teaching younger children. And I can't tell you how much I learned from this experience. First of all, as a teacher, professionally, I developed from just being someone who could only deal with high school students to being able to engage with the younger students. So I'm that very rare teacher that has had the experience of teaching 3 years old all the way up to 18 years old. And one of the things I brought to the primary school lessons is I did an experiment on planting by the moon. And the students had 4 different seed types, and we had an experiment which seed type would flourish under a certain moon. So we did this experiment, but as experiments are in a school, it wasn't perfect. But I like to think that students got to take away a little bit about how astrology can be used instead of just the horoscopes or the sun signs that we use. So a bit of the history of schools, and part of the problem, why we are where we are, is that the educational system is very old. It hasn't changed much since the Industrial Revolution. And the idea behind education, modern education, is that children are taught in the same year groups. And they are taught like 30 children to one teacher to save money. And what the aim of education is that it was to teach children the same things at the same time, with the expectation that they'll all have the same amount of growth and development. And I'm sure you can see where the problem is with that, because nowadays, we have a wide spectrum of learning needs that have to be addressed in the classroom. The other problem is with education is that it's often the first area to have budget cuts, and specifically the subjects that usually lose money first are arts. So, reading, maths, and English is where our teaching is focused on, and sciences. Another big difference, of course, is, as time has gone on, more and more conflicts have been created between parents and teachers and students. When I was a kid, if I got in trouble at school, I'd be in so much trouble at home. It never happened. I never got in trouble at school. I was always kind of a diligent student and loved to read. But nowadays, the teachers are under a lot of pressure to provide this free service, under a lot of pressure and a lot of workload. So I'm hoping that this lecture too highlights some ways that parents and teachers can work together to focus on what is most important, which is a child's education, but at the same time understanding the limitations, and for parents to realize that they have a huge role in their child's education. It's not just about expecting the teacher to do everything. So astrology can help parents help their children as well. The biggest problem we have in the past 20 years is that young teachers come into the profession straight out of university. And there's a lot of effort put into training these teachers to be able to take on a classroom, a lot of time and money. And these young teachers often don't last for longer than 5 years. And then we get another teacher. And the younger teachers, of course, aren't paid well either. They start at the bottom rung of the ladder, and they leave the profession before they get a chance to get good at it. So that's a big problem that we're having post-pandemic, as we start to get children back to school, is that they've had 2 years of very disruptive teaching. If you follow the news about TikTok, students are doing this horrible thing where they dare each other to slap a teacher. And so this was a problem before, that teachers didn't stay in the profession for very long. But now more and more teachers are leaving altogether because they can't pick up the pieces, and they feel under a lot of pressure, and they feel that they can't live up to what's expected of them. And this is a really, really sad state of affairs. So what I'm going to say to you tonight is there is so much astrology can do to help support those students, so that we are giving them the education that they've missed out on. And we're kind of integrating them back into a kind of a normal school day, because that's the problem, right? Is that they've, hadn't had to get up at a certain time every day to get to school. They've fallen out of the habit of, being able to learn and discipline themselves to sit still with what is required in the classroom. So it's very, very hard on everybody to get used to this new way of reintegration. So as I said, I passionately believe that with a little astrology, everyone can be a little bit happier in the classroom. And if you'd like to hear more about this and more in depth, my book is called Growing Pains, Astrology and Adolescence. So I did come across this thing where I worked in a Christian academy, and I was effectively barred from using astrology in the classroom. I think I told the story in the previous session I had with Stormie. But I decided that, telling me not to do something is a pretty good way of guaranteeing I'm going to do it. So I found a way of using astrology to improve my confidence as a teacher, to sort of organize myself so I understood my learners, and also just kind of took the pressure off of all the things that teachers are expected to do. So we teach children by year groups, and this will be really important in a minute when I explain to you the impact this has. But when I go to work and I'm waiting for my agency to ring, they'll ask me, I got a year 10 class, would you like to teach them? And so I have this little cheat sheet that I look at, and I'm going to look and see, what kind of classroom it is and whether or not I want to teach it. So this is slightly outdated, but it can be, when I use it, of course, it's updated. And if I get a younger classroom, someone calls me up and says, do I want to teach year 4 or whatever? Here it is again. I just look across and see what I can expect from that classroom. Now, this is completely different to a teacher who doesn't use astrology in the classroom, because I'm prepared. I don't have to go through 3 or 4 months of trying to understand my learners. this little cheat sheet tells me how the children learn, what they expect from discipline, and how I can help them to become better learners, just at a glance. So I'm all for anything that makes my job easier, and that little cheat sheet really is something that I use all the time. A bit of background about my research, because it is proper research based on the triangulation. It starts off with astrological theory. You know, what do we expect from the Jupiter signs and Saturn signs? Backed up with external resources. In my case, it came from psychology resources, and backed up with statistics that are from on-the-job experience as a teacher. So I'm going to start with my external resources with Jean Piaget, born in the late 19th century. He has a background in natural history and philosophy, and he came up with his theory by observing his younger nieces and nephews. And he came up with this idea that was said to be so simple, only a genius could come up with it. And Einstein said that about his work. And so I thought, okay, if Einstein's going to say that about Jean Piaget, I better pay attention to what he says. So Piaget's theory of cognitive development, which I'm just breaking down in really basic pieces, starts off with the sensory motor period from birth to 2 years old. This is when a child develops object permanence. That is when they know that a hidden object hasn't disappeared, it's just hidden away. So a ball, you know, show a child a ball and you put it behind your back, and a child who has developed object permanence is going to look for the ball. They know that it hasn't just disappeared into thin air. The preoperational stage from the age of 2 to 7 is when children are developing their sense of logic. Concrete operational stage from 7 to 11, they have rigid beliefs based on how they were raised, but they're less egocentric, and they are able to take on other people's, start to understand other people's beliefs. And then there's a formal operational stage from 11 years old to adulthood. And this is when they starting to learn abstract ideas and deductive reasoning. They learn how to predict how things will turn out just based on the evidence in front of them. Their idea of perception, and it shows especially in art, they are starting to get to grips with how things are 3D and how to draw things in 3D. So it's important to note that Piaget was about qualitative observations and not so much statistics and analysis. He also had this thing about accommodation and assimilation, which is basically the way you were raised really affects you for the whole of your life. And so if you are born a Catholic, for example, you may learn about other people's belief system, but you will always sort of understand Catholicism better because you learned it when you were younger. Now, Erickson is another psychologist that has had a huge effect on me, born around the same time as Piaget. Now, he said that life stages are held in two extremes, and this tension can't be maintained. So the individual has to accept that both of these extremes are useful and required. And when they accept that, then a virtue is developed. And this idea, I mean, I can't think of a better way to describe the opposition aspect, two extremes held in tension, and to a lesser effect, the squares and conjunctions. And his work had a huge influence on growing pains. So here's just an example of the first stage, trust versus mistrust. The basic virtue that comes out of this is hope. So if you imagine a child being held by a parent, and the parent, for whatever reason, is walking and maybe stumbles a bit, and the child thinks he's going to drop. Now that's a very instinctual thing for a fear for a child to have, is of being dropped. But they have to understand, either I trust my parent or I don't trust my parent. But usually what comes out of this basic virtue is hope, comes from this experience. So let's talk about the astrological theory then. So Jupiter, astronomically, is the biggest planet. It's a gas giant. It has lots of different kinds of satellites orbiting it. This is Jupiter and its Galilean moons. Mythologically, we know that Jupiter is the god of thunderbolts and lightning. He is a sky god, so he has a good perspective on what's happening down here on Earth. He has omniscience and omnipotence, and he is able to make judgments on what is going on down here on Earth. Jupiter has many moons. It handles these things confidently. These things don't crash. They're pulled in by Jupiter's gravitational force. And so this becomes, the confidence becomes a part of how astrologers interpret Jupiter. And there's this kind of leap of faith that happens in the learning process, which is associated with Jupiter. Now, people ask me, okay, how come we don't use Mercury? And the reason why I don't use Mercury is, first of all, in a classroom, there'll be a Mercury, an example of a Mercury in every sign in that classroom. But with Jupiter, because Jupiter is much slower than Mercury, taking about 1 year to go through each sign, the classroom has a Jupiter signature. And for example, you could have the entire classroom consisting mainly of Jupiter and Aries learners, which gives you an idea of how to teach these guys. Now, there might be, Jupiter and Pisces learners as well, or Jupiter and Taurus learners, but it's easy to take note of that. It's not the same thing as trying to remember, 30 children and, where their Mercury is. And the other thing is, Mercury is kind of rote learning. For example, when a teacher holds up the letter T, what sound does this make? And the 6 and 7-year-olds will say T. That's rote learning. But Jupiter learning is putting together these sounds to form words, and the words together to form sentences. The sentences will form paragraphs, and eventually paragraphs will form essays that students write when they're in high school and they're a little bit older. So, Mercury is those small little pieces of information that you memorize, whereas Jupiter is that leap of faith to take these small pieces of information and make something bigger out of it. So there's key Jupiter stages. The first one is from birth to 3 years old. So Jupiter will move through 3 signs, and it will come to a square aspect. I'll show you how this looks on a chart in a minute, but just let me talk you through these key Jupiter stages. 3 years old, when a child is 3 years old, it's expected that they'll be toilet trained. I mean, accidents happen, but they're basically toilet trained. They have a lot of questions about the world around them, and they have imaginary companions. And they're able to walk without assistance and able to speak and be understood by someone who hasn't been around them a lot. And if you're a parent, you'll recognize this as a stage where you don't need to carry diapers around with you. You don't need that stroller anymore. You don't have to have so much equipment. Your child has developed more independence, which makes it perfect for parent and child to be able to explore the world without carrying all these burdens with them. At around 6 years old, children are learning how to read and write, and this is transiting Jupiter opposite to its natal position. They still have their imaginary friends. I mention this for a reason. We expect children to be able to have lists of words that they should be able to read by the time they're at 6 years old, but we expect them to be able to read reasonably fluently, and we have ways of measuring that if they need help. For example, if it's suspected that a child has dyslexia or attention deficit disorder, if they're not reaching their targets, educators will pull in a professional who specializes in helping these kinds of children learn so they don't fall behind. But obviously with this pandemic going on, a lot of children have fallen through the net, and they need extra support, or they haven't gotten the support that they needed because there's so much pressure to catch everybody up to where they should be. The waning Jupiter square is around 9 years old, and this is actually one of my favorite year groups. They often don't mix very well between boys and girls, but they're starting to be able to distinguish between imaginary and real fears. So they're no longer afraid of the monster in the closet. they're afraid of things like a pandemic, or they're afraid of what they hear on the news, like terrorism, for example. They're worried about the parents splitting up, or even death. They're starting to take on the really big traumas that are going on around us, what they hear in the news or what they actually experience in their family. Now, the reason why I mention these imaginary companions is because these children have a real sense of reality. And my experience in teaching this year group is I'm a good storyteller. I can tell stories, forever. I can tell, mythological stories from my own tradition, which is Ojibwe. I could tell stories for hours. And I've taught all the year groups. And, if I have a bit of time at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if I'm teaching 3-year-olds or 18-year-olds, I can fill in the time with the story. And most kids, even the 18-year-olds who are now adults, will listen patiently and, will allow themselves to be entertained. But it's this age, these 9-year-olds, they're the only age group that will ask me, Miss T, is this a real story or is this something that you made up? They want to know, they want me to distinguish between fact and fiction. And then there's a Jupiter return at approximately 12 years old, just before 12 years old. And this is, of course, we recognize this as being the onset of puberty. Also, when we send students to the big school where their friendship groups change, they have more intensive lessons, more teachers, more subjects. There's a lot going on in that Jupiter return year. My experience of teaching this year group is that they're still like children, though. They still want to play games. They still want to have fun. They aren't quite ready to settle down into serious study, but they are. They have that still have that childishness, that charming childishness that is such a joy to teach. And this is another one of my favorite year groups too. So the opposite of Jupiter is the planet Saturn in astrology. Now, we keep our children safe by telling them no. They want to do something that seems dangerous to us, we're going to put an end to it. And obviously, as a child gets older, they start to make decisions around what they want to do and what they see as being safe. So as parents, the older children get, the more concerned we can be for their safety. And this especially intensifies in teenage years because, students are more influenced by their peers. They become, I'm going to say, reckless in the decision-making in the teenage years. They're more tempted to try things that maybe parents would be fearful of, like drinking or cigarettes. And also sexuality is developing as well. And these things become concerning for parents. These aren't the concerns we have for these younger children. But the way we keep our children safe will become the voice that we hear in our heads as adults. Things like, don't do that, you're going to make a fool of yourself. Don't do that, you're going to get hurt. All these things, all these memories can actually prevent us as adults from trying new things or breaking out of our habits to grow as a person. So if you can understand that, then you see that Jupiter is about the growing, whereas Saturn is about the honing, the practicing, the being more precise as you get older. And of course, Saturn keeps you safe as well. Now, teachers are having a hard time. It's a difficult profession to be in. And I don't actually agree with this sign at all. No talking, no laughing, no smiling. In fact, no nothing that induces any kind of pleasure, which is a very Saturnian kind of way of teaching. And I think that it's actually the opposite. I think my class is full of laughter, but it's also very carefully observed so that I don't have an out of control classroom. Because if you have an out of control classroom as a teacher, you're going to be in very deep trouble indeed. But I do know that some teachers do teach this way. There is an expression we have in teaching, which is no smiling before Christmas, which to me is terrible. I dislike it. And this is another reason why I think astrology can really help us get to know our classes better. So if we understand a child's Jupiter, then we can teach them, and we understand our own Saturn as well as theirs, and we can keep them safe. And so therefore we create these really clear boundaries of what is acceptable versus what is not acceptable. And in relationships too, your partner might not have the same Saturn sign as you. So you have parents who maybe are a couple years apart who have very different approaches to discipline. Say, for example, you have a parent with Saturn in Aries, and they have very clear ideas about how to be self-disciplined. Whereas if you have a parent with Saturn in Taurus in a relationship together, they are more concerned with building a good life. So this can create friction. And so for parents or for people who are considering becoming parents, understanding their Saturn sign can become so important in preventing future problems, because you can make the groundwork before you make that commitment. You can get it all, it can't be perfect, but it can be a huge step towards understanding how you are going to function as parents when you actually become a parent. And when you understand that, then you can focus on your child's Jupiter to help them grow as a person. And the lines of communication can be open because you understand the limitations, but you also see the opportunities in this very important relationship between parents and children. And even in unconventional sort of relationships, maybe with single parents, there is still a need to understand the Saturn, and it would go on to also include adoptive parents or step families. That little bit of understanding can make a huge difference in how parents and children relate to each other. And for teachers to understand their own Saturn can help them become more disciplined, more aware of where they need to improve their teaching and how they can do it, and how to help their children, their students that they're teaching, become better learners too. So Saturn also has its key stages. The first Saturn square is at 7. So with Jupiter, the important milestones are every 3 years, but with Saturn, it's every 7 years. And that first square is at around 7. And what you see in children, Saturn rules the hard parts of the body, the skin, eyes, and teeth. The children lose their baby teeth at around this age. And then they're capable of telling time as well, and they start to understand the difference between right and wrong. At the age of 13 to 15, it fluctuates a bit. Children, of course, of this age are instantly recognizable for their braces and orthodontic work. Here in England, they begin exam work. They start to choose what it is that they want to study, as opposed to the smorgasbord approach that we have at the Jupiter return. And children of this age crave independence, as well as they're moody and uncomfortable. You can see this shift. There's a huge difference in teaching 11-year-olds and teaching 14-year-olds. The waning Saturn square happens around the time that adults leave formal education, if they've gone to university or are taking an apprenticeship. They usually become settled in work. And then the Saturn return, Adele famously sings about the Saturn return. And this is when sort of you are learning and compiling and taking stock of all the lessons that you've learned. And I've heard, astrologers on Twitter and things making jokes about, how Saturn dictates to you what you will learn. And that's true enough. However, if you understand your Saturn and how it functions, you can also see what Saturn is trying to teach you. So it's terribly important to understand your Saturn and its cycles as you continue to grow and develop. And so let me say it again, Jupiter's every 3 years for its crucial stages, and Saturn's around every 7. So I'm talking about conjunctions, squares, and oppositions, and the closing square cycles. So that means that if you have a child with Jupiter in Aries, their cycles of development are all going to happen in cardinal signs. So cardinal signs, if you have a class of cardinal signs, you know that they like things to be speedy. They like things to be, Jupiter in Aries, for example, does not like to analyze things. They just want, speed rounds, competitions, and things like that. And the other signs are similar. Now, Jupiter in Jupiter in Cancer is sensitive, and they are worried about the other learners in their classroom, but they too prefer things to be at a pace. And it's the same thing with Jupiter in Libra and Jupiter in Capricorn. Now, I found what works with these guys is that they enjoy the fast pace, and they don't like taking things slowly. So if you're going to do something that requires, like, for example, in English, analyzing a text, they might not like it, but that is part of their learning process. So if you understand that as a teacher, you can put things into place that's going to support that type of learning so that they can get better at slowing down and analyzing things and reflecting on things. And if you understand it as a teacher, you can show your children how to do it, and you put them through the paces. The fixed signs, Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius, are a different kettle of fish. These guys need like a warning that things are going to change. They're very different to the cardinal signs. They don't like things to be short and snappy. They like to take their time and just have a more leisurely kind of pace so that they can take in what they've learned, digest it, and then eliminate what they don't need. They need things like a warning, like, okay, we're going to do this. Here's an overview of the year. Here's what we're going to be in October, and here's where we're going to be in December. And by the end of this term, this is what you're going to learn. And then in that way, it doesn't feel like the whole entire world is changing just because you change a topic in the classroom. And the mutable signs, Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces, these guys you would think are the academics, and they are very bright, and they're ruled by Jupiter or Mercury. But what I found about these students is that unlike the cardinal signs who thrive on competition, these guys don't like to be exposed, their progress to be publicly put in a place where everybody can see it, because they are very self-conscious. They are always comparing themselves to each other. They are touchy about their progress. And so these guys, their challenges are about being able to self-assess their work and being able to help their neighbor with their work, because they understand where the weaknesses are. So getting these children to work together towards common goals becomes quite important. So this is roughly the key stages, and it's probably a good opportunity to take a snapshot if you like. So just let me summarize. At 3, the first waxing Jupiter square. At 6 is the first Jupiter opposition. To age of 7, the first waxing Saturn square. At 9, the waning Jupiter square. At 12, we got the first Jupiter return. At 14, we have a very curious mix that happens, and that is the Jupiter-Uranus sextile. I tend to use hard aspects. Why? Because they force us to do something with the situation. But with these sextiles, what we have going on is Jupiter is about expansion and confidence, and Uranus is about rebellion. And so we have this thing where these two planets sort of combine to intensify the experience. And I know from doing behavioral research that this is the year that teachers find most challenging to teach. And there will often be a little bit of difficulties on the first day of school when you get your timetable and you realize you have to teach this year group. So I've got a little bit of advice for that too. So I'll just park that there for the moment. And then at 15, they have the first Saturn opposition. So these cycles continue throughout a person's life, every 3 years for Jupiter, every 7 years for Saturn. But this is just how it looks in childhood. And using a qualitative research, just to say it again, I found that this year group at 14, 13 was less enjoyable than the other year groups. One of the reasons why it becomes difficult at this year is that decision-making in adolescence is often quite poor. They And as a society, we respond by making laws such as, you can't drive until you're 16. You can't make an adult decision until you're 18. Here in England, you can't drink alcohol legally until you're 18 in a public premise. You can't rent a car from a commercial agency until you're 25. However, you can stand trial as an adult for murder or another crime at the age of 14. And we have this situation where, there are children who commit terrible crimes, and we need to know how to support them. And I would say that, the support has to happen from a young age. We have to be able to recognize the signs that a child is struggling or is having situations where they haven't understood the outcome of their behavior. And this is because of all the brain development that is going on in children during adolescence. So it's quite exciting, really. As a young child, the person relies on the inner reptilian part of the brain, particularly the amygdala, which is to do with reactions to things like fear or a threat of some sort. And it's also like the flight or fight response is located here in the amygdala. So that's how young children process threatening situations. Here's an example of how the brain develops all the way up to around the age of 20. So you can see that the red bits are that inner reptilian part of the brain that's being stimulated. They're relying on their instincts to get them through difficult or tricky situations. But as they get older, more and more of the blue part, the higher part of the brain is shown here. And so you can see in particular, there's a huge difference in adolescents as they grow older. And then finally, as they become adults, the prefrontal cortex is as developed as it's going to become. The other thing we know from studying the adolescent brain is that girls experience the burst of neurological development before boys do. And it's quite a significant difference. So girls really around the age of 11 are ready to study. They understand, what's expected of them, whereas boys don't quite have this big adjustment. So the experience of girls is that, they're in a classroom with these immature boys, and they may maybe have some sort of resentment that the boys are holding them back in some way, whereas boys, will not have this a mature attitude towards their learning. And thinking about gender issues as well, we're now talking about that there's not just two genders, there's many. And I'm really, as someone who suffered from gender issues, I'm really glad that this is the case now. So please don't think that I'm talking just about males and females. I'm just looking at this data to explain how the brain functions in these genders. So this is an up close view of brain cells. The brain is rewiring itself during adolescence, and here is a gap between the brain cells, and the information needs to jump over this, very much like that leap of faith I was talking about. So if you picture your brain in adolescence as being like a huge mansion, and it has new carpet, and your shoes are muddy. So when you go into this mansion, you walk from room to room, you leave mud tracks around. And obviously the rooms that you use more often become more worn down and more muddy, whereas there might be rooms that you never get to. So you have all this brain development going on, but it comes to an end. And once it starts to slow down, the doors to the unused rooms will close. They don't stay closed forever. They can be open, but it takes a bit more effort to open them. Another thing to consider is that at the Jupiter return, with all this brain development, for a child who's been neglected or has fallen behind in some way, this is a wonderful opportunity for that child to catch up. And studies have shown that children can catch up if they're given the right opportunities to do so. So this is the difference between a so-called normal child here, and here's a child of the same age who suffered through extreme neglect. And you can see that inner reptilian part of the brain has been overdeveloped. But the child can catch up. But think about what happens at this age too, is that they're sent to a new school at around the age of 11, where they have new teachers who don't know them very well. And for parents who have children with special needs, it can feel very much like they have to start all over again. And it's a frustrating situation for everybody. But with good communication, cooperation with teachers, supporting parents, this child who's suffered can catch up. And I think that's really, really good news. But we need to understand that this is a window of opportunity. It doesn't stay open forever. So the age of 15, we have all the brain development going on. After the first Saturn opposition, the human brain becomes more fixed and rigid. So we have lots of opportunity, a couple years to help that child grow and develop, see new things, experience new things, and kind of whet their appetite to learn about the world around them. Now, the habits of a lifetime are formed in adolescence. You can do a little experiment yourself. You can go on to your favorite singer or whatever and look to see what was going on during their adolescence. And you're going to see a lot of examples of, you know, someone being given a guitar at the age of 12 and they become a rock star, or they get involved in acting classes and they become an actor or a professional actress. So with that, I'm going to talk through quite quickly about 3 people who could have been in the same classroom had circumstances been right. And that is Leonardo DiCaprio, Angelina Jolie, and Drew Barrymore could have been in my classroom because they're all brought up, you know, all have, were born in the same academic year. So what I do for my students is I like to know who my oldest children are and who my youngest children are. So in my mark book, I don't put children in alphabetical order. I put them in age order. So, you know where I'm going with this. I can see immediately who my Virgos are because they're at the top of the class, right? And I can see who my Leos are. My research with behavior data has shown me that Leo boys are more often in trouble than, say, Virgo boys. And this isn't really to do because Leos are naughty. That's not it at all. It's to do with Leos being the youngest in the academic year. So anyway, this kind of list helps me just to be able to see who my youngest children are and who my oldest children are, because we know that there's a world of difference that 1 year can make in the age of a child. So I know all my children's Jupiter and Saturn signs. I can probably just look at them and know, you know, what Jupiter sign they have because of their size. But let's say I got a problem in my class, and I'll show you a more specific detail example of how this works. But I know all the Jupiter and Saturn signs. But if I have a problem with a child, let's say they're really playing me up, and I, as a responsible adult, can look at a child's chart, the noon chart, because I don't know what time they were born, and look at what's going on, compare it to my own chart, and come up with ways that I can manage and change my behavior to suit the needs of the child, so that we're not constantly butting heads during lessons. We're actually, you know, I'm stepping back and I'm saying, okay, well, here's how I can help you, and we can come to some sort of negotiation, and that way I'm not seeing them in my detention every week. You know, we have an understanding, we have communication. I've done what I can do to help the child, and therefore the conflict can be resolved. And this is something that doesn't happen very often without the help of astrology. So you can see here that Leonardo DiCaprio has Jupiter in Pisces in its rulership traditionally, and it's got Saturn in Cancer. So I want to know when he's going to have his Jupiter return. So this is just a graphic ephemeris that is on professional astrology software. It just helps me pinpoint when the Jupiter return is going to happen, how many times Jupiter connects to its natal position, which I'll show you has an effect on how the child learns. Drew Barrymore. Okay, so I'm just gonna look at her noon chart. She has Jupiter in its rulership and Pisces in its exaltation in Pisces. And she also has a personal planet, the moon, conjunct Saturn. So you can see that Drew and Leonardo have the same Jupiter sign, as well as the same Saturn sign. And here's Drew's Jupiter return, just put on a graphic ephemeris. So when you're teaching this year group, this would be 6th grade for Americans, you know, they have a lot of boisterous energy. And anyway, but as more and more children reach their Jupiter return, it gets even more crazy. And eventually the whole year group will kind of tip towards all the children having their Jupiter returns. And that's for a teacher when things can get or feel out of control, and where the Saturn has got to come in to try to contain all this energy without wrecking the opportunities for learning. So here's Angelina Jolie. Now she's different to the other two. She has Jupiter in Aries with a lot of personal planets there, but she still has Jupiter in Cancer. So remember what I said, you know, Jupiter in Aries likes things fast and competitive. Jupiter in Pisces are a mutable sign, so they're more reflective, and they don't need the speediness that the Jupiter and Aries students learn. So if you put a Jupiter and Aries student next to a Jupiter and Pisces student on your seating plan, which you have to give to inspectors to justify your decision for the seating arrangements, you can put something like, student A, who has Jupiter and Pisces, you don't put Jupiter and Pisces on your seating plan though, is inspired by the learning pace of student B, who has Jupiter and Aries. Whereas, you know, Jupiter in Aries student helps keep the Jupiter and Pisces student on their toes. I've seen teachers, you know, waste an awful lot of time trying to justify their decisions, but just knowing a little bit of astrology, I never had this problem where I was wasting hours trying to work out my seating plan. So I'm just looking here at the Jupiter return of Angelina. So let's assume that, you know, in this classroom, I got 27 other learners usually, but, you know, I got a problem with Drew in that, you know, she started smoking cigarettes at 9, she's drinking alcohol at 11, smoking marijuana at 12, snorting coke at 13, and all before her first Saturn opposition. Well, she became legally emancipated from her mother at 15, which is a Saturn opposition. Remember, she had Saturn conjunct the moon, and transiting Saturn would have been opposite that point when this was going on. Angelina went through a different kind of problem in that she was also from an acting dynasty, but she wanted to become a funeral director at this stage. And also she started self-harming. Self-harming is a real problem in schools. And like anorexia, it kind of occurs in rashes, in that if you have an anorexic child in school, there will often be other children that developed a similar problem. So you need to call in an expert and deal with the problem as soon as you notice it has arisen. Okay, so the two girls we're going to look at a little bit more in depth. But Leo, he had no known problems during this time, and he went on to star in Titanic in 1997, just in time for his Jupiter return. So remember, he has Jupiter in Pisces, you know, water. So with the oppositions and the returns, and in fact, any transit, owing to retrograde direction, you can have up to 3 times that the connections happen. So what it does is it actually lengthens the time that the transit is going on. So there's really no, you know, you can't say either having this transit happen once or 3 times is either good or bad. It's just like, it's kind of like saying, you know, do you want to have, you know, your presents distributed over a couple weeks at Christmas time, or would you rather have them all at once on Christmas morning. Both have their opportunities and both have their drawbacks. So Drew had 3 of those oppositions, whereas Angelina Jolie only had 1. So what I do for a lot of my case studies that I'm looking at is I like to look at the timing of astrological adolescence, which in my theory it starts at the first Jupiter return and it ends at the final Saturn opposition. So let's look at Leo. He's the oldest boy. He's the oldest of these 3 that I'm looking at. So he had his first Jupiter return in March 1986, quite young when he had it. 11 years, 8 months is the average. He had 3 Saturn oppositions. And so the time lapsed between his first Jupiter return and final Saturn opposition, which is what I call astrological adolescence, is 4 years, 5 months. Let's look at Drew Barrymore, born only a few months after Leo. She had a Jupiter return when she was a little bit older than expected. She had those 3 Saturn oppositions. The time lapse in her adolescence, viewed astrologically, is 2 years, 10 months. But let's look at Angelina, who's the youngest. You would say, okay, she's got to be the most immature, but actually it's the opposite. She had 1 single Jupiter return at 11 years, 11 months, 1 single Saturn opposition at 14 years, 7 months, meaning that she had 2 years, 4 months in astrological adolescence. So even though she's the youngest, actually viewed astrologically, she's the most mature. So, if you knew this about her, you could put in extra support for her. A child who self-harms, it's something that's, alarming for everybody involved. So there could be people to help her when difficulties arise. And by the way, not all children who experience a short adolescence have difficulties. It's just, as I keep saying to you, a matter of recognizing the signs, looking at the astrology going on around it to understand what to do about it. And by the way, knowing what to do about it is part of my experience in using this. Part of my training as a teacher is knowing how to handle these problems and how to spot them. But also, as an astrologer, this kind of understanding enhanced my astrology practice. And I'd like to say, maybe a little bit controversially, that if you're practicing as an astrologer, you should not be having unsupervised under 18-year-olds in your office at any time. And not even somebody who's trained in child protection would do this. We would understand immediately that there's a danger in this, and that the child could make accusations, or there could be a misunderstanding that could lead to further difficulties. So it's really important that if you're going to work with children and astrology, that you have a parent or legal guardian in with you, that the session is recorded or the Zoom session is recorded. So there could be no further, no chance of being accused of something. So this time is really important to keep track of. And discipline here, I'm just going to point this paragraph out. A study of sample of teachers shows that they have problems with discipline. And I've already mentioned that this academic year, a lot of teachers are talking about behavior of students and how it seems to have become a lot more of a difficult issue post-pandemic. So as a teacher, if you have problems disciplining your students, you're going to have a lot of pressure put on you to sort this out very, very quickly. So one of the ways you monitor it as a teacher is that you have lesson observations, and you're expected to be able to manage your class. And if you can't manage your class, you're going to have another lesson observation and another if you can't manage it. And eventually you're going to run out of chances and you're going to be asked to find a different profession. But discipline is so important for teachers in understanding how their students need to be disciplined, and Saturn can help that. This is a situation as a teacher you never want to have, and that is the classroom is completely out of control. But, defining good behavior in schools is sitting down, being quiet, and doing the work that's been given to you. And in my view, that's a very old-fashioned way of looking at behavior. But it is the way that this institution of education defines behavior. So in my school that I worked at for many years, we had a system when a child was misbehaving that we gave them a warning. And a formal warning sounds like this. This is a formal warning. You're disrupting the class. If you carry on, I'm going to give you a detention. And if the child carried on, I'd have to fill in a report in quadruplicate, and a copy of that went to the child's homeroom teacher. We call them form teachers here in England. Homeroom teacher, a copy of it would come to me because by this time I was in charge of all those homeroom teachers. We call it head of year. And a copy would stay on the students' records, and a copy of that report would go home. So this is looking at the incident sheets from this particular school that I worked at. And you can see that Jupiter return children by percentage received more incident sheets than, say, the Saturn opposition children a few years later. You can see that they are, it's quite a big difference between these two year groups. So this is in half term 6. Here in England, we stay in school until July. I know it sounds terrible, but we do. So that's half term 6 for 2011. Here it is again, half term 6 the next year, a different cohort, and we can see the same sort of pattern going on. The Jupiter return children are in trouble more often than the Saturn opposition children. But we can also break down behavior by type. So let's look at this. Here we go. We have Jupiter return children, also including that Uranus, Sextile Uranus age group too, are more in trouble for disruption compared to the Saturn opposition children who are settling down in terms of behavior. And here it is replicated 4 times. You can see that the blue line here, key stage 3, are the Jupiter return children. The blue line corresponds to the blue line of the key stage 4 children, which are the Saturn opposition children. And you can see in each case, the number of incident sheets are significantly lower. But we can also look at inadequate work. So you can see here, Jupiter return children are hardly ever in trouble for not doing enough work, whereas the older children are more in trouble for not doing their work because they're preparing for exams. But if you've been listening to me and what I've been saying about brain development, you will recognize this as being a tragedy, because this age group is when all the brain development is going on. Therefore, all the attention and all the efforts to get the children to do their work should be here on these children. So what happens in these children at this age are in this kind of no man's land. They're coming from a primary school where every single piece of work has to be marked. A teacher has 30 books to look at, whereas a secondary school teacher, if they're teaching a subject like history, they can have up to 480 books to look at. And I can tell you that, as a history teacher, I didn't look at their books that often. I got them to self-assess, and I used, the skills that, I had from learning about astrology to help inform me about what these children need. But I'm rare. I'm not, I'm about the only astrology teacher that I know of, or sorry, teacher that uses astrology in the classroom that I know of, although I know that there are a few other teachers who have an interest in astrology. So, I think that parents have this wonderful opportunity to really support teachers in ensuring that children of this age, 11 to 13, have opportunities to learn, that I know we can't travel, but we can armchair travel. We can do lots of things to support the child's reading, to make sure that that brain is developing, and every opportunity to develop that brain is being taken. And so here it is again, this inadequate work. You can see that the younger children are very rarely in trouble for not doing enough work, whereas exam years, the children are seeming to be more encouraged to do more work and more thorough work. So this is part of my research on phases of the moon and behavior, because I was sitting in my office with the other heads of year, and we're in charge of all those incident sheets. that are written every single day by teachers. And one day we were having a bad day. You know, there was just so many incident sheets coming in. And my colleague, who knew I was an astrologer, made this really sarcastic comment. He said, "It must be a full moon." And I thought to myself, wait, hold on. It's not a full moon. It's actually a new moon. And this question, making fun of me as well in the bargain, got me thinking, wow, what if we could figure out when children might misbehave? So anyway, it started me off on a project that kept me very busy for a few years. So this idea that people are somehow more troublesome at the full moon is a good example of communal reinforcement. And we get communal reinforcement all the way back into Shakespeare, all the way back into Pliny the Elder and Aristotle. And when they suggest that the moist nature of the brain meant that it was subject to lunar influences. However, the scientific community says that although there's so-called supermoons, perigee, syzygy, have an effect on the perigean tides, the actual effect of the lunar pull on humans would be minimal. So I thought to myself, okay, well, we need to check this out and what's going on. So I started off with a very, very small sample, only 3 months. Now remember, kids aren't in schools at weekends or Christmas holidays or Easter holidays or the summer holidays. So that made it really difficult to keep track of. But nonetheless, I did what I could, made the adjustments I needed to make. And this is how I divided up the lunar cycle. So you can see that I'm counting incident sheets that are submitted just a couple days before the full moon and just a couple days after the full moon, and the same thing for the new moon. I'm counting them a few days before the new moon and a few days afterwards. So what did I come up with? Okay, so between September 2012 and July 2013, making those adjustments I was talking about, I found that significantly the new moon was when children were misbehaving. And then I thought, okay, well, what about menstrual cycles? And what about, the fact that boys receive far more incident sheets than girls do? Let's take the girls out of the equation and look at boys only to see if they're responding to the new moon. And it seems that they are. Then I thought, okay, well, there's different types of moons, new moons and full moons. Let's look at them when they are squared to the nodes at higher latitudes. Is this still holding out? And you can see that it still is the new moon at higher latitudes that children are misbehaving more often than the other phases. And here it is, just to irritate the scientists, it's replicated the new moon again at higher latitude, which is counterintuitive to what an astrologer would think. An astrologer might say that children misbehave more often during eclipses. And this shows that that's not true at all. And so here's my nerdy bit, my statistics. I was helped by Robert Curry with these, and you can see that my p-values are pretty phenomenal here on this research. So I thought that a lot of this behavior and lunar phases was because during all this brain development, teenagers experience a huge change to how they sleep. Teenagers can't sleep until later at night, and so they're more likely to be playing on their phones or reading or whatever it is that they're doing and not sleeping, and therefore they get up early the next morning, grab themselves an energy drink, and try to keep going, which this creates a huge sleep debt. We also know that everybody experiences 20 minutes less sleep during the full moon. And it doesn't matter if you can see the full moon, if you're in a cave or whatever, you still experience this disturbance of the circadian cycle. Now, I thought that because of all the brain development going on, that this was the problem that the teenagers were responding to. However, one of the problems of being a researcher is that sometimes you get proven wrong. And this is just very preliminary research, but I found that even primary school students were experiencing this new moon effect of poor behavior. But there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And Robert and I are carrying on with our work. And here it is again, just different two terms. We can still see that the new moon is problematic. So as I said, the sleep cycle specialist, Mary Koskinen, was looking at it, and she says that we have evidence that the distance to the nearest full moon phase significantly increases human sleep, and evening melatonin levels when measured under strictly controlled laboratory conditions, where factors such as light and personal moon perception can be excluded. And then here's the sleep expert saying that the effects of inadequate sleep are more than mere annoyances. They affect our mood and how we perform at work, school, and home, and behind the wheel as well. Lost sleep also accumulates over time, and the more sleep debt an individual incurs, the greater the negative consequences. And as I said, energy drinks, in my opinion, and in the British government's opinion, are a huge problem, so much so that these are now illegal for under 18s to purchase. However, if you notice, if a new school building goes up, you will notice that these little corner shops also appear, because they know they're going to get business from the school kids. And they're not monitored as well as they should be. I mean, it sounds like a small thing. It's just a legal, an energy drink. What's the harm? And business is business. Also, you notice that when a new school is built, chicken and chip shops become more common, and they start popping up as well. Again, children have their dinner money in their pockets, but they don't eat at the school where we, have healthy meals available. They'll save their money and eat chicken and chips on the way home, which is a problem. So, we got this problem with putting young people in prison, and we spend more money. It says America, but you can take your pick, put whatever country you want in there, Australia, United Kingdom, or whatever. America spends more money in putting young people into prison than it does in educating people and therefore preventing the problem that whatever the person's experienced. So, we seem to have everything backwards in terms of, what we want our children to, have a good education, but yet it's often the first place it gets money taken away from it is the educational system. Teachers are, driven to work harder and harder under very difficult circumstances, which is, causing a massive problem. And teachers are leaving the profession in droves. It just all seems like it's really backwards and a system that's not working anymore. So, look at this. It costs £65,000. That's about $100,000 to put a person into prison, and £40,000. It's about £60,000 a year to keep them to keep them there. I mean, that is a huge amount of money. A teacher's salary is half of this, at least, and a teacher's assistant, is half of this. So it's a really, really big problem that we're putting all our efforts into imprisoning young people instead of giving them, creating opportunities for them to use their brains and good sense to be productive citizens. The other thing I want to say about this too is that schools are kind of like prisons. We tell them, this is the time you're going to eat, this is the food you're going to eat, this is the time you're going to leave. We tell them when and when they can use the restroom. So when it comes to making choices and decisions, they can't. They're kind of used to this sort of routine, which isn't too different from prison routine. And we try hard on the school dinners, but I'll tell you that the food that is provided is probably not much better than prison food because it's done on the cheap. So finally, I'm going to look at a little bit about sleepiness done from somebody who's not an astrologer, who seems to have chosen the astrological timings that I was talking about, those the 29-year mark, which is around the Saturn return. So he took 15 antisocial boys showing antisocial behavior, and he retested them at 29. So what he was looking at was self-reported sleepiness. And if a child was sleepy, abnormally so, at 15, Adrian Rain wanted to go back and test them to see where they were at the age of 29. So here he is looking at these 15-year-old schoolboys and then revisiting them at their Saturn return, although that's not what he called it. And what he found out was that if a child, sleepy adolescents are more likely to become criminals. So, sleep is important, and making sure that children have the right amount of sleep, taking into consideration all the massive brain development that's going on. I would highly recommend that teenagers actually start school maybe at around 11 or 12 o'clock, as opposed to the 9 o'clock start. Let them have their natural circadian cycles. Let them get rest. Because you know what happens at weekends and holidays. A kid goes through the whole entire academic week getting less and less sleep, gets to Friday, stays up really late, and on Saturday, wakes up really late. And the same thing on Saturday night, stays up really late, gets up really late on Sunday, and then they're back to school on Monday morning, and they're tired because they're sleep deprived, because their circadian cycle is so out of whack. So it makes a lot more sense to work towards keeping people out of prison, understanding their sleep cycles, and understanding when to get help when danger signals are given. So this is the final point. I know I said the sleepiness was the final point. Just one more. We're getting there towards the end. Everyone knows that serial killers are born, not made. Okay, so this is a really cute little kid who grew into Ted Bundy. Now, I'm going to say you can look back on his life. You can go look back on various biographies or what's on Wikipedia, and you can look at the things that Ted Bundy was going through. And a person born in the same day is the romantic novelist Penny Jordan. Now, she would have the same Jupiter and Saturn as Ted Bundy. They would have different ascendants and maybe different moons, but essentially they would have the same Jupiter and Saturn, and they would reach these developmental milestones at the same time as well. So what she did, he was kind of brought up in this creepy sort of circumstance where his mother, he was told that his mother was actually his sister, and the reason why was because the grandparents were super religious, and they didn't want anybody to know that their daughter had given birth at a young age. So Ted, being a Scorpio, had this inclination that something was wrong. And also he wasn't well supervised. He felt he didn't quite belong, and he wasn't well supervised. So he was actually, during his adolescence, peeping in windows and things like that. And then he developed his creepy habits through poor supervision. Whereas Penny Jordan had this family who were really supportive, and they encouraged her writing. They encouraged her to be the best that she could be. She was writing in competitions and things like that. So her parents understood, maybe by chance, what she needed in order to grow into someone who was successful. Whereas Ted, it's almost like the opposite happened. Like he was ignored, and it wasn't, supported the way he should have been. And things turned out, as we know, very badly. And I don't wish to glorify him by talking about what happened, but I will say, a little trigger warning here. Ted Bundy said, "The big payoff for me was actually possessing whatever it was I had stolen. I really enjoyed having something that I'd wanted and gone out and taken." Possession proved to be an important motive for rape and murder as well. Sexual assault, he said, fulfilled his need to totally possess his victims. Now, even though they had completely different upbringings, this gives a really good example of how they used their energies, one for the most evil things possible, and the other for creating fiction. So Penny Jordan wrote a book called Power Games, and the subtitle is Power Over Life, Love, and Death, which is kind of similar to what Ted is saying here. This is just a more acceptable way of channeling that kind of negative energy. And I even think this guy looks like Ted Bundy, the all-American kind of guy. Okay, so 251 babies are born per minute worldwide, each being raised by parents in unique circumstances. So many factors affect child development: their environment, their relationship with the parents, their birth order, their diets, their neighborhood, and many, many other things. Some of these things we can do little about, and some of these things require commitment, devotion, and discipline. But if you understand your Saturn, your children will learn how to honor theirs. This will permit them to explore the world. Excuse me, sorry, I jogged the camera. This will permit them to explore the world through their Jupiter, to take the reasonable risks it takes to grow and develop, and to realize that life is in a constant state of flux and change. Life is nothing but a roller coaster. And this is just the, you can read at your own pace, the parable of the sower, where it's the idea that seeds fell on different types of ground. And the results were some didn't grow at all because they fell on rocky ground, whereas some thrived. And our job as parents and teachers is to find the kind of soil that a child thrives on, and can learn and develop and become a person that is happy. And I'm not saying rich, I'm not saying successful in the eyes of anybody else, but the child's heart. And if we can find ways to collectively help each other to achieve this, I think that you'll agree with me that the world would be a better place indeed. So this is just a final look at the astrological significators. You might want to take a screen grab of this. It goes through all the significant ages. I stopped at 60 because I ran out of space, not because you stop learning and growing at 60. I just ran out of space. It's 3 years for Jupiter, every 7 years for Saturn. You might need an astrologer if you don't know how to use an ephemeris to work out exactly when these ages are, but this just gives you a rough guideline to where to put your energies as a parent, what age group. And I'm not even suggesting, for example, that you ignore 8-year-olds in favor of 6-year-olds. I'm just saying, to just an awareness of, how to be more efficient with your energy. I hope that it could be helpful to you as a parent in the most difficult job in the world. Okay, so I hope I haven't run on too much, but this is just kind of the final information bit, where to find me and stuff like that. Here's my website down here. I have a free chart calculation service on there. I have lots of stuff about astrology and education on there. My first book was Growing Pains, about astrology and adolescence. My second book was Mirror, Mirror, which just came out a few days ago. Very happy with that. I do a lot of work for the Cosmic Intelligence Agency, ESAR, and OPA, which are all professional astrology organizations. And I have a Solar Writer Adolescent Astrology Report, which you can also get from my site. It's $20 for about 16 to 18 page report. But mine is unique because I look at these important issues going on in adolescence, which you won't find in any other report. Very nice to look over with your adolescent child. Anyway, that's my final website where you can find me. And I thank you very much for joining Stormie's YouTube Academy. I'm Alex Trenoweth. I hope you enjoyed this, and if everything works out well, we should be answering questions in the chat box. Thank you very much.